All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for being so prompt. I'm here to kick us off for the afternoon session. And just a change to our program for panel 3, Materiality in Modern and Contemporary Asian Art. Unfortunately, Professor Wu Hong, the director of our center, can't join us today because of personal circumstances. So we are extremely fortunate that Dr. Midori Yamamura has agreed to chair the panel 3, Materiality in Modern and Contemporary Asian Art. So in order to save time, we have placed all the bios in the brochure so that you don't have to, so we can save time. But because Dr. Yamamura is a late addition to our program, I'd like to just read you her brief bio. So Dr. Midori Yamamura is Associate Professor of Art History at the CUNY Kingsborough and an Alkali Bodian Distinguished Scholar at the CUNY Graduate Center, where she specializes in global contemporary art history, focusing on Asia and its diaspora. She's the author of a book many of us know and love, Yayoi Kusama, Inventing the Singular, from MIT Press of 2015. And she's also the co-editor of Visual Representation and the Cold War, Art and Post-Colonial Struggles in East and Southeast Asia, which came out of Routledge in 2021. As a feminist art historian of color, her interest is in exploring the ideas that emerge in marginal space in society. She was one of the contributors to Kusama's Tate Modern retrospective catalog. Her present research focuses on art projects in the rural areas of Japan and the Philippines. In fall 2025, she will be a residential fellow at the Cordillera Study Center, University of the Philippines at Baguio. All right, so without further ado, I would like to hand things over to Dr. Midori Yamamura.
Thank you very much, Chelsea. So I would like to reserve as much time as possible for the discussion. So the introduction is going to be very brief for everyone. We will be having the speakers, Dr. Ignacio Adriasola first, and then after that, Orianna Cacchione will go, and then Joyce Chung. So the presentation is going to take place in this order, and then after the presentation, I would like to ask some questions, and hopefully we'll first discuss amongst the panel participants, and then I hope as many people as possible in the audience can also join. So thank you so much, and please welcome Ignacio and his bios in the program.
Oh, do I have to hold a microphone while I speak? Yikes. Let's see. I need a little bit of room here. A little bit. There. So first of all, I just wanted to say thank you for having us over here, for bringing us together to the Center for the Art of East Asia, to Chelsea Foxwell, to Reiko Tomi, especially, to Professor Wu Hong, and to Ellen Larson and the team for hosting us. It's really an honor to be able to be here with you today, gathered on the shores of Mishigama, the great water in the Ojibwe Anishinaabe language, and I would like to acknowledge the traditional inhabitants of the land as I begin. What I will be presenting today is drawn from a chapter for a book. I can tell you a little bit more about the gestation of the project during the Q&A if you're interested. And when I was asked to present on the topic of materiality, I thought, I guess this is a good fit on the question of what happens to painting in the moment after 68. And part of the reason why I thought it would be interesting to talk about this is because it reminded me, the question, Reiko's prompt, reminded me of something that I felt when I walked into the Yale Union building and I saw Alan's and Reiko's co-curated show on Matsuzawa Yutaka, where this beautiful kind of pink colored space and these sheets of paper were laying on the ground. And all of a sudden I thought, yes, this is conceptual art, but deeply, deeply, deeply material. So this is more or less where I want to go. Enokura Koji, in 1991, wrote the following comments on his practice. Some critics say, I am part of the monoha, the school of things. But rather than objects, I am more strongly interested in matter. In my work, I have until now deconstructed from within the elements that constitute objects, bringing out their materiality. This is why calling me Bushitsuha of the school of matter, rather than Monoha of the school of things, would be more appropriate. The above comment, articulated late in his career, points in part to the singularity of Enokura's practice, but at the same time, it invites a return to the controversies attending the formation of the Monoha as a critical category and its historicization. So my paper in part asks what to make of Enokura's insistent contention, because this was not a one-off, he is constantly saying this. His insistent contention that the aim of his practice, and importantly, also that of his contemporaries, was materiality and not things. So he called into question monoha as a category, period. Consider, for example, place. Enokura submitted this breakthrough work to the legendary Tokyo Biennial of 1970. In this work, Enokura laid on the floor pieces of warahanshi, low-grade straw paper, of various sizes, over which he poured machine oil. Imbibition transformed these lowly materials into an uneven, semi-translucent, and reflective surface. Enokura's submission joined those of 34 artists selected by the prominent art critic Nakahara Yusuke for the international exhibition, which for the first time showcased works by Japanese and non-Japanese artists side by side, irrespective of nationality, and Reiko has written eloquently about the importance of this gesture. Nakahara, whose research for the exhibition took him throughout Europe and the United States, had witnessed firsthand the change of the guard represented by the foundational exhibitions When Attitudes Become Form, organized by Harold Seaman in Bern, and Anti-Illusion, Procedures Materials, which was held at New York's Whitney Museum in 1969. Nakahara's selection of artists for the exhibition responded in real time to the emergence of new approaches in art internationally, identifying parallels and convergences between the trajectories of Japanese and foreign artists. And the show is kind of like a who's who of post-60s art, including people like Carl Andre, Richard Serra, Crystal Mario Mertz, Yanis Kounelis, Giuseppe Pennone, Daniel Burin, among Japan-based artists, including Takamatsu Jiro and Matsuzawa Yutaka, as well as up-and-coming figures than Sekine Nobuo, Liu Fan, and Suga Kishio. Enokura was among the show's youngest participants. The exhibition's immediate context, then, was the significant challenge posed by process-based practices to the notion of art, understood as an international field of activity, as well as a burgeoning critical discourse focused on elucidating its implications. While profoundly material, I want to underscore, the idea of process in art divests from the type of retinal pleasure traditionally associated with visual arts, especially as it relates to the ideal of completion within an artwork. In a narrower sense, process came to characterize a loose constellation of practices, which has later become identified with the more general umbrella term conceptualism, along with fellow traveling approaches such as action, dematerialization, that likewise divested from a merely optical interest in art. In his later years, Enokura himself referred to place as a type of installation. While his use of the term is retrospective, his early work more generally does reflect some of the concerns associated with this medium, its manipulation of space and site specificity in particular. As a semi-sculptural work, the puddled oil, grease, and irregularly piled paper in place defamiliarized the space of the gallery through its loose and almost formless demarcation. Yet the format and materials used in this work may as easily recall painting as an idea. More specifically, oil painting, the medium Enokuda trained in, which much of his work began referencing in an increasingly explicit manner later in the decade. It could be argued that in this piece, Enokuda still relied on the basic ideas of support and medium, albeit in an entirely decontextualized manner. The paper and glass, plexiglass as well, the floor, grease and oil. However, as art critic Masaki Motoi has noted, it is not the materials themselves, but their interaction that Enokuda repeatedly highlighted. In place, such interaction slows down to a grinding halt as the stagnant oil puddles on the floor, seeping through and saturating the paper. Place stages process as material interaction, underscored by the slowness with which the medium is absorbed by its support. This quiet, durational aspect of the piece would thereafter become a signature component of Enokuda's practice. Indeed, rather than its material components, or sozai, it is these verbs, to puddle, to seep, to saturate, that most aptly describe the parameters set up by the work. This is not painting, then. Or is it not painting? Like many of his contemporaries, Enokuda abandoned the creation of painting by the late 1960s. His friend and colleague, sorry, I just skipped ahead. His friend and colleague Fuji Hiroshi has referred to this moment at which his generation became active as one in which painting had become altogether impossible. Painting represented an untenable position. Formally and politically, it was an exhausted language that had come to epitomize what they perceived as the artificial division between art and life. In this regard, Enokuda and his cohort correctly intuited how painting condensed Japan's modern trajectory and its contradictions, the whole language around kaiga. The artists that immediately preceded Enokuda and his cohort, it's important to note, those who had taken part in the controversial Yomiuri and Dabandan shows of the late 1950s and early 1960s, had been among the first to overtly refute the primacy of painting, both in terms of the denial of painterly illusionism and the rhetoric of individual expressivity found in gesture. They instead opted for the creation of wryly mimetic, three-dimensional works fashioned out of everyday materials. In doing so, they sought to overcome both the bourgeois illusion of artistic autonomy, while also appearing to resist any functional appropriation of art. Of great concern to the Ampan generation had been modernism's theological conception of capital A art, which, as they saw it, pandered to a blind faith in artistic subjectivity. And I'm showing you Miki Tomio for a reason. The ear, Van Gogh's ear, the cult of aesthetic, subjectivity, right? At the cusp of the anti-war and New Left contestations, at the end of the decade, painting came under renewed attack. Associated with particularly insidious forms of political and cultural control, it was decried as a tool of the establishment by young artists emerging in this milieu, and was deemed to be an impediment to the transformation of society. Painting as a medium was associated with the most reactionary aspects of the cult of artistic subjectivity. Like Dada before them, artists in this period found in painting a practice that epitomized fine arts ideology, a soothing balm that allowed bourgeois society to ignore its contradictions through the aesthetic illusion of autonomy. In its most radical form, this critique entailed a wholesale rejection of painting. For example, in Hikosaka Naoyoshi's floor event, also of 1970, in which Hikosaka turned over a pail of latex paint on the floor, announcing his departure from art altogether in pursuit of revolution. The struggle. To Enokuda, painting, is this working? Yeah. To Enokuda, painting was personal, and how could it not be? He was the son of an established oil painter, Enokuda Shogo, from whom he learned the rudiments of drawing and painting. Succeeding in exigent entrance examinations, the younger Enokuda enrolled at the famously conservative oil painting department at Tokyo University of Fine Arts, and later joined its master's program, where he studied under the eminent modernist Yamaguchi Kaoru, graduating in the watershed year of 1968. The son of one painter and the disciple of another, Enokuda's practice is marked by a complex relationship to a medium that he strived to resignify. The struggle involved a negotiation of what I call the names of the father. The term highlights in Lacan's psychoanalysis the metaphorical role of the father, understood as an agent instantiating the law. Lacan's rearticulation clarifies that the names of the father designates not a specific individual, but is one signifier among many, pointing to a function, I lost that. Lacan's rearticulation clarifies that the names of the father designates not a specific individual, but is one signifier among many, pointing to a function regulating desire. In Enokura's case, I find the negotiation of two symbolic figures who act as avatars concealing a third. Two of them are perhaps obvious. As given name, family name, the signifier Enokura, in excess of designating the biological real father, points both to a family and a history, in the sense of roman familial, as well as a trade. Meanwhile, Yamaguchi, as academician, shapes painting into a type of given tradition or object of knowledge. A third type is perhaps less evident. This is painting itself, which as a system of knowledge at once regulates and supports desire. It is at once the law and is also a vehicle that contains the promise of art, as the self's encounter with the world. Enokura's practice grapples with the impossibility of extricating painting from the law. A passing consideration of Enokura's early work, which I've been showing you, suggests that at least initially he shares with both his father and his teacher an array of formal interests, negotiating the fine line between figure and ground, figuration and the abstract, and seeking within surrealist idioms, such as the dreamscape, for example, a type of resolutive structure that could conjoin disparate approaches to representation. And in the full chapter, I develop a discussion of these blobs and clouds that are seemingly kind of appearing everywhere in this moment. By the late 1960s, however, Enokura begins to enact an emphatic turn away from painting in his practice. So there's two works that I wanted to mention. The first is The Ceremony of Walking from 1969, in which viewers were instructed to follow a particular pathway designated with arrows on the floor around a so-called indeterminate area, where Enokura had set up metallic plates and pillars that crisscrossed the room, and that viewers were preventing from entering. Meanwhile, Decoloration, on the left, involved the creation of photocopies of graphic magazines and the burning of the originals, whose ashes were exhibited on the floor next to them. Both works, I note, are classic in the context of late 60s art, in that they perform a type of refutation of painting, a negation enacted through the gestures of axial rotation, the elimination of the frame, and the disaggregation of their constitutive elements. While, like plays, both works appear to introduce an altogether different medium to his practice, it could also be argued, however, that Enokura was in fact seeking to produce the paradoxical effect of painting without its materials, a type of ambivalence foregrounded through the fact of not painting. The following year, and shortly after exhibiting plays at the Tokyo Biennial, Enokura took part in a group show organized by Takayama Noboru, a close friend with whom he had collaborated on The Ceremony of Walking the previous year. Space Totsuka 70 was held in the Tokyo suburbs, actually between Tokyo and Yokohama, in Nanimonai Tokoro, Totsuka. Was held in the Tokyo suburbs at a large abandoned lot adjacent to the rundown building where Takayama lived. Eschewing the conventional gallery setting or the apparent neutrality of the white cube, so closely associated with the exhibition of contemporary art, Takayama and his colleagues sought to resituate art practice within an entirely extra-institutional space. In preparation for the exhibition, Enokura and Takayama, together with Fuji Hiroshi and Habu Makoto, worked for a month to clear out the grounds of the yard, using this experience as a starting point for the work. In the 4 works he presented at Space Totsuka, Enokura relied on pre-existing features found in the overgrown yard. Concrete walls with unusual shapes, one of them propped up by a piece of timber, a feature that would reappear in canvas works later in the decade. For quality of wetness, and I'm speaking just about the one on the right, Enokura buried concrete slabs he found in the yard, covering them with a square plastic tarp of around 10 by 10 meters. He then covered this with earth, and with a watering can, he dampened the ground, thus generating a dark impression. The piece's horizontal format was similar to work Enokura submitted to the Tokyo Biennial earlier that year, but perhaps more explicitly called attention to the nature of the interaction he was seeking to highlight, as well as the specific physical properties of otherwise unremarkable everyday materials. Enokura's work initially appears attuned to a line of research that originated in the late 60s in the activities of the so-called monoha, or school of things. Variously described as a loose group or more possibly a trend, monoha is a term used by critics to characterize the work created by a generation of artists who at the end of the 1960s began to problematize the relationship between viewer and artwork by focusing on the actuality of the thing. Like in Okuda, these artists turned to a restricted use of materials, often relying on the deadpan presentation. But while Inokuda undoubtedly held much in common with his contemporaries, sharing some of the visual markers most closely associated with the monoha, he emphasized aspects of art making that also set him apart from their concerns. The overlaps and differences between such practices can be identified in Inokuda's varying approach to process. For example, in his submission to Nakahara's 1970 Between Man and Matter show, artist Suga Kishio plastered concrete over a staircase at the biennial's venue, relying on minimal materials in order to defamiliarize the space of the gallery. Yet rather than engaging in an act of self-assertion, Suga sought to foreground the objective existence of the staircase itself. For Suga, only a strict adherence to a rule of minimal involvement on the part of the artist, and thus a restriction of any fetishizing markers of subjective trace, could ensure that a work would generate the conditions for a new type of objectivity. This is different from Enokuda, right? I think in place and quality of wetness, Enokuda stains mediate the return of subjectivity to the artwork. But this is done in a very passive manner, and this was recognized by artists at the time, by art critics at the time as well. The way that he relied on a language of tactility, of wetness, right? I would argue that there's clear indication that the artist was intent on avoiding any semblance of expressivity. Commentators often noted how touching and adherence appeared as fundamental issues in Enokuda's work. This radically departed from painting's orthodoxy, which located subjectivity in markers of expressivity, such as brushwork and individual style, as well as probing the legibility of figural representation in the demands of the names of the father, which aims to replicate the mastery of the artist as subject. The passivity of process presented a possible avenue for re-engaging painting in altogether different terms. In untitled canvas works of the late 1970s, Enokuda began using a piece of timber dipped in spent-up machine oil to create impressions on a large unstretched canvas. He would leave the timber on the canvas for several days when the oil would seep, as the oil would seep through the fabric, generating an evenly shaped imprint. Slowly, the imprint became surrounded by a ghostly stain as the oil separated, and a faint aureole enveloped the dark figure it formed on the canvas. As with Untitled Number 13, created for the Venice Biennale of 1978, in a number of these works, the piece of timber is adjoined to the canvas. Referring later to his serious intervention, in which he revisited the imprinted canvas procedure, Enokuda characterized his approach as fundamentally passive one. Quote, "It is almost as if the blank canvas was forcing me to paint," end quote. Enokuda sought an altogether different role for himself and for painting. In relation to his position, he was a type of passive agent, acting in a similar way to how the pieces of timber produced, in spite of themselves, an expanding stain. This afforded him a space from where to critically engage the present, a new type of subjectivity. Okay, I have a little bit, and please, this is like the one part that I really wanted to read. A dream analysis. In 1980s, Enokuda realized that his interest in subjectivity put him in dialogue with the work of a new generation of contemporary painters, such as trans-avant-garde painter Francesco Clemente. He writes a review about this. These were painters who were interested in producing a new type of narrative in painting. While some of these turned to a celebration of consumer society, others, like Clemente, appeared to retreat to a world of interiority. And Okuda understood the risks entailed by a turn to interiority as a dangerous type of romanticism. What alternatives could be available to someone seeking an escape from the killer tendencies of contemporary society other than self-referentiality, quote, dreams, fantasies, and narcissism, end quote. The question articulated here, of course, could also return to Enokuda's own practice, and in more ways than one, it carries the mark of self-interrogation. Enokuda's review of the Clemente show begins with a description of a recurring dream, his own. The sky is gray, a bog extends to the horizon, tall grasses grow out as far as the eye can see. Enokuda wades up to his waist in soft mud. Something indeterminate touches him, like fabric or tree limbs growing from underneath. Quote, "Every time I see this stream, I see a waterfall at the corner. I move against the current, and as I reach it, I begin to sink. Then I wake up," end quote. So, in his dream, Enokuda looks for the source, or what gives shape to what he sees and experiences, landscape. He moves against the current, facing growing resistance. Inadvertently touching the world, he experiences at once attraction and revulsion. And Okuda struggles through various earthly materials, seeking an encounter with the true origin of what he experiences. And when he finally reaches what he believes is the source, he finds a hole within which he begins to sink. What interests me in this dream is Okuda's investment in material struggle, the recognition of a type of unpleasure in his movement, and in the encounter with the world and the anxiety on facing the limits of creation as a form of self-assertion. Sinking within a hole, the void that is the self, he wakes up. The dream suggests an opening to the real, what repeats itself and does not go well. This is significantly different from the type of negation at work in Okuda's earlier attempts to refute painting. It presents an actual working through of the names of the Father. Thank you.
It always feels so awkward to speak into a microphone in such small rooms. But thank you so much to Ellen and to Reiko and to Chelsea and to Wu Hong for inviting me. It's always a delight to come back to University of Chicago. And thank you to Midori for your comments. And of course, thank you to Dora and the larger CAEA team for all of the amazing work you've done putting this exceptional weekend together. It's wonderful. This paper presents very initial attempts to weave together separate but overlapping threads of research that have repeatedly led me to question the legacy of art tapestry, soft sculpture, and the Institute of Art Tapestry Varbanov, IATV, and the early globalization of contemporary Chinese art, a legacy that has often been overlooked or glossed over in histories of the 1980s. The IATV has persistently come up in research for recent curatorial projects. I first became aware of the importance of the IATV working on the exhibition, The Allure of Matter, Material Art from China, with Professor Wu Hong. Later, the IATV appeared again when I was conducting research into the role of abstraction in the work of two women artists, Shi Hui and Wang Gongyi. And lastly, research for the Monochrome Multitudes project that displaces the mid-century Euro-American roots of the monochrome through a global framework and challenges the primacy of painterly-based monochromes. With material experiments, again illuminated the longstanding international connections and precedents of the IATV, especially as connected to pioneering fiber artists globally. Today, I will attempt to weave together, just briefly, these disparate threads. In 1987, Chinese contemporary art premiered at the Lausanne Tapestry Biennial, marking the first time artists working in post-Mao China were included in an international biennial. The three large-scale, we might call them monumental, hanging artworks created by 4 artists were selected for the juried exhibition and displayed prominently together. In Longevity Show, made by Shi Hui and Zhu Wei, the tufted tapestry expands into space as it hangs from the ceiling, floating along the wall and measuring 5 meters tall. The bulbous forms on the left are an abstracted rendering of the character Shou, providing the work's title. The largest, Guwenda's Wisdom Comes from Tranquility, deep black threads bind 2 hanging scrolls to central panels of bright red, plain woven tapestry. The scrolls are emblazoned with abstracted characters floating above watery landscapes. The central red cascading weavings are decorated with red stamped seals. And by scale, the most modest, Liang Shaoji's Art of War intersperses flat woven panels of off-white and moss green rectangles with bamboo slats, branded with phrases from Sun Tzu's eponymous treatise. By 1987, the Lausanne Tapestry Biennial was considered the preeminent venue for showcasing fiber art. Founded in 1961 by Jean Lecat and Pierre Pauli, it played a major role in defining new tapestry, presenting innovative artworks that explored material and process in space. Coined by Swiss art critic André Kunze in 1973, new tapestry focuses on fiber's unique formal qualities, its materials, spatial dimensions, and conceptual possibilities. This movement contested ingrained the hierarchies that separated the fine arts from craft, and as art historian Janice Jeffries has argued, and I quote, positioned textile art within an expanded view of art history. At the same time, the biennial provided a unique melting ground, giving space to artists working in the United States, Western Europe, Eastern Europe, and Latin America to present contemporaneous practices that shared common threads. It showcased artworks by artists from the Eastern Bloc and Latin America, including Magdalena Abakanowicz from Poland, Marin Varbanov, who we'll talk about, from Bulgaria, and Olga de Armorel from Colombia, alongside and radically on par with their American and Western European contemporaries, like Sheila Hicks and Claire Zeisler. Ultimately, as Jessica Gertzwitz has argued, the biennial foregrounded overlooked artists, ideologies, and political milieus that draw together textile artists from localities formerly treated as periphery in art history, especially those with authoritarian regimes and state-run cultural institutions, providing other articulations of modernism. From this vantage point, Shehui, Jue, Guanda, and Liang Shaoji's artworks were woven into an alternative lineage of modern and contemporary art that foregrounded material experiments over formal autonomy, female identifying artists, and artists from countries outside of Western art centers. Accepted into the 13th biennial, their artworks hung alongside 47 other artists from 13 countries. These included diverse formal, material, and conceptual responses to the exhibition's theme, the wall, which acknowledged tapestry's origin as wall hangings while embracing the heritage of the new tapestry movement that liberated itself from the wall. Examples of the other artworks on view include Kyoki Kumai's metallic cloths that covered the wall in a shimmering haze, Simone Pulpen's ribbon-spun shells protruding from 10 tufted columns, Joyce Crane's rendering of nascent microchip technology in iridescent films and metallic braids, Eva Kordzak Tomaska's translations of photographic images into figurative black and white textiles, Ellen Phillips' grid woven with barbed wire, and the undulating pockmarked wall covering by the new tapestry pioneer Ritzi Jacobi. Despite this milestone, references to the 87 biennial have largely been relegated to passing mentions or footnotes in the written histories of contemporary Chinese art, and particularly its internationalization. Of course, there are many reasons for this marginalization. The dismissal of fiber arts as craft, not high art, the overwhelming emphasis on domestic art practices, the associations of the global art world with Western Europe and America, to name a few. Yet the biennial was important, not just to the artists who participated, but to contemporaneous discourses at the time. This is perhaps no better illustrated than the front page coverage it received in Zhangguo Meishubao, Fine Arts in China, whereas in the United States, the biennial was covered not by the major art magazines of the time, for example, Art Forum or Art in America, but in American Craft magazine. Only recently has scholarship begun to revisit the outsized impact of tapestry art in post-Mao China, including that by Chinese art historian Ke Yu Yan and international textile art historian Janice Jeffries. Today, I will weave the 1987 Lausanne Tapestry Biennial into the domestic context of 1980s China and the early internationalization of contemporary Chinese art. Looking first to the radical experiments that took place at the Institute of Art Tapestry Varbanov, where Shihui, Zhuhui, Liang Shaoji, and Gu Wenda created the artworks that would be selected for the biennial, and then repositioned these practices as fundamental to understand the early internationalization of contemporary Chinese art. I hope that this starts to unravel the prevailing discussions in China at the time that sought to position contemporary Chinese art in relation to a world defined by Western Europe and American modern art, and instead suggest alternative networks of exchange and affinity, especially with those in Eastern Europe that have long been under-recognized and under-discussed, despite their enduring legacies. This follows closely with what Christine Ho has argued in her pioneering study on craft in early Mao China, in early Mao China, and the ways it buttressed networks of socialist globalization. For Ho, craft disrupts the idea that the global must be equated with modernism, and instead suggests alternative globalization. Shifting to a post-socialist framework, recuperating fiber arts into our understanding of the internationalization reveals precisely how that history was mediated by non-traditional and unconventional materials. The artworks selected for the biennial were all created at the newly established Institute of Art Tapestry Varbanov. Founded in 1986 by Bulgarian artist Marin Varbanov at the Zhejiang Academy of Fine Arts in collaboration with the Zhejiang Carpet Factory in Hangzhou, the institute built on the long history of silk weaving in China and the new tapestry movement. Varbanov had long-standing connections to Eastern Europe, China, and Western Europe. In fact, he studied textile design, dyeing, and weaving under Professor Chai Fei in Beijing, graduating from the Central Academy of Fine Arts in 1958. Returning to Bulgaria, he established a tapestry workshop at the Academy of Art in Sofia. There he continued to integrate not only folk and vernacular motifs, but also their processes and materials to create innovative tapestry forms. He quickly became affiliated with the so-called Slovak Vogue, a new generation of fiber artists from Eastern Europe who pushed the material and formal limits of the medium off the wall and radically into space. And he showcased his work in the 1971 and 73 Lausanne Tapestry Biennials, building his reputation as a pioneering artist throughout Europe and eventually moving to Paris. Under Varbanov's leadership and cosmopolitan experience, the Institute of Art Tapestry became one of the most international and experimental departments affiliated with the Zhejiang Academy. Not actually an academic department, the Institute was freed from the disciplinary boundaries that defined and codified teaching across the academy. Instead, students and teachers from all departments could work together at the Institute, creating fiber-based works and soft sculptures, Ruan Diao Su, and freely integrating unconventional and non-traditional materials with more conventional wools, hemps, silks, and cottons. Varbanov's teaching emphasized the character of the artist as opposed to copying masters, training and basic skills so that students could explore a new weaving art language, the integration of concept, design, form, experimentation, and production, and adherence to oral teaching that included answering questions relentlessly. And perhaps most important for us today, the elevation of material and technique to the same level as thematic and formal characteristics. Ultimately, Varbanov encouraged a critical pedagogy that not only emphasized learning form and technique, but also encouraged experimentation and the development of new art languages alongside the integration and quite often celebration of these materials. For most artists, their time at the Institute marked an inflection point in their practices towards increasingly innovative experiments with unconventional, non-traditional materials and abstract or non-representational art that paralleled larger trends happening across China. Shihui, who would eventually lead the Institute, quickly abandoned traditional materials to explore the fibrous characteristics of Xuan paper. She also abandoned the linguistics underpinnings of work like longevity in favor of abstract sculptural forms that emphasized the bright white monochromatic characteristics of the materials she used. Liang Shaoji shifted his focus first to silk and then to silkworms, constructing crude structures, often with barbed wire, that the silkworms would then directly spin their silk onto, contrasting the fragility of the living creatures, the delicate silk, and the unyielding metal wire. Guenda also turned to organic materials, working first with blood and eventually settling on human hair as his medium of choice. Evoking hanging tapestries, Gu's United Nations series is constructed with multiple, often hundreds of intricately crafted hanging panels made entirely with hair. Expanding beyond those recognized in Lausanne, the representational printmaker, Wang Gongyi, first experimented with abstraction at the Institute, anticipating her eventual shift to inky abstract paintings. The Institute transformed the marginalized and overlooked space of craft into a site where artists were freed from the material, thematic, and disciplinary restraints of the academy and allowed to experiment, opening new paths in their practice. Throughout the 1980s, material explorations provided a pivotal means for artists to define new art forms. Wu Hong has identified the shift in his pioneering conceptualization of material art. However, today I want to demonstrate the ways in which materiality actually dominated the earliest national and international displays of contemporary Chinese art. If we include the Lausanne Tapestry Biennial, alongside two other pivotal 1980s exhibitions, China Avant-Garde exhibition held at the National Art Museum of China, and Magicians de la Terre organized by the Centre Pompidou in Paris, both in 1989, new tapestry emerges that can distinguish what we might call the 1980s internationalization of contemporary Chinese art from the well-canonized 1990s globalization. From this vantage point, the Lausanne Biennial sets the precedent for the exhibition of increasingly non-representational and material-driven artworks. The China Avant-Garde exhibition and Magicians de la Terre have often been understood to bookend the 85 New Wave movement and a new period of contemporary Chinese art marked by its going to the world. As critic and curator Fei Wei has argued, and I quote, "If we say that the China Avant-Garde exhibition of February 1989 was the closing ceremony of the 85 New Wave, the Magicians de la Terre was the opening ceremony for Chinese contemporary artists' movement to the world." Here on the pages of the small exhibition booklet, we can see the vast material experiments that were on view and the number of artists affiliated with the IATV included in the exhibition, including Guenda's Wisdom Comes from Tranquility, which was showcased as the second image in the catalog, Liang Shaoji's E-series Magic Cube, and Wang Gongyi's abstract ink paintings are all interspersed with other examples of non-traditional and unconventional materials. 3 months later, Yang Jiechang and Gu Dexin and Huang Yongping were the only Chinese artists included in Magicians de la Terre, an exhibition billed by its organizers as the first global exhibition of contemporary art. In massive scale, the artworks they produced in Paris for the exhibition exemplify the trend towards non-representational, materially-driven artworks previously on view in Lausanne. Yang Jiechang painted hundreds of layers of ink to create bold black monochromes. Gu Dexin expanded earlier experiments, melting, burning, and bending scrap plastic into an immersive chamber. And Huang Yongping scaled up his infamous wet method, washing newspapers into pulp and using that to form massive turtle-shaped tomb sculptures. Weaving these examples together provides a new reading of the globalization of contemporary Chinese art, one that suggests new materials provided a different way for artists working in China to access the international art world, one that is rarely discussed or emphasized. Instead, Magicians de la Terre is often compared to the 1993 Venice Biennale, which almost exclusively showcased the representational painting styles of political pop and cynical realism, ultimately obscuring the role of the earlier Lausanne Biennial. Influenced by his own peripatetic experience across Eastern and Western Europe and China, Farbanoff frequently wrote about the global configurations of contemporary art. And he talked a lot about contemporary artists erasing geographic boundaries. While these writings were mediated by his early experiences of socialist cosmopolitanism and the international New Tapestry movement, he was impacted by the contemporaneous debates that were happening in China that contended with the rapidly changing landscape of the post-Mao period. No longer confined by clear state ideology, artists experimented with new visual languages, unmooring their work from the socialist realism of the previous period. At the same time, new art forms from abroad were introduced on the pages of books and in art magazines, and exhibitions held throughout China and through international exchanges. Artists and critics alike debated the impact of these external influences, often through familiar dichotomies of East versus West, modern versus traditional. Many saw the adoption of modern and so-called Western art as an attack on classical Chinese art, while others saw a new opportunity to go to the world. We might ask then how the Lausanne Tapestry Biennial fit into the world Chinese artists were going to, and if its general exclusion from these conversations might suggest other ways of entangling the complex and often overlooked aspects of globalization, the ways it has been repeatedly equated with the so-called Western art world, the ways it reinforces colonial center-periphery relations, the ways it prioritizes the high arts over craft, kitsch, and other lower art forms, and the ways it assigns value to certain artists, practices, and materials over others. Thank you.
And next, I would like to invite Joyce Chung from curator at Asian Art Initiative. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Midori.
Good afternoon. Hi, my name is Joyce Chung. I go by she, her pronouns. I am curator at Asian Arts Initiative in Philadelphia. Before I get into my presentation, maybe I can give you a brief introduction on what Asian Arts does, that give you more context on what about the exhibition that I'm going to share with you today. The Asian Arts Initiative started back in 1993 in the wake of Rodney King verdict and LA uprising to alleviate the tension between Black and Asian communities and to build cross-cultural solidarity in the community. We are a multidisciplinary art center, community-based. We work with a lot of artists from underrepresented communities, including immigrants, LGBTQIA community, labor workers. We do a lot of cool stuff, exhibitions, performances, music concerts, film screening, artist talks, after-school curriculum. We feel very lucky to have owned this building on Vine Street in Center City, Philadelphia. First floor, we have 2 galleries and black box theater and classrooms, and upstairs, that's our office, and third floor, that's our rental spaces. So we are always constantly busy with a lot of pop-up events on weekends. So I joined the Asian Arts Initiative back in 2022 as a curator. So what I do is organizing exhibitions and performances and some of the programs in tandem with the exhibition. For example, last Sunday, we put together a big symposium with the theme of Solidarity Politics in collaboration with Asian American Arts Alliance and Museum of Contemporary African Diaspora and Arts from New York. We invited their Bandung residency Black and Asian artists, and then we pair them with our own fellows to foster community engagement. And we look into a lot of different practices in art and community activity. And maybe one other thing that's coming up is our film screening of Yuri Kochiyama documentary put together by Ria Tajiri, Philadelphia-based artists, filmmakers who recently earned Guggenheim Fellowship like 2 weeks ago. Yeah, we're very excited about what's all coming up. So today I'm going to talk about the exhibition that I curated recently at Asian Arts Initiative. It's how Crescendo, How Art Makes Movements, 1981 to 1999. So it's based off of 2 years of research on these musicians from Asian and Asian American artists and communities in the 80s and 90s. It's a historical survey of the creative explosion that took shape within Asian American community that was taking shape in the 80s and 90s. That's a significant time period in terms of Asian American social movement as well, because after the murder of Vincent Chin, in Detroit, 1982, by 2 white auto workers, the community really brought together, and then there's a big shift from individual ethnic-focused individual activity toward more like a pan-Asian solidarity. So we are focusing on that time period and that creative volume that increased during that time period. And during my research, I was also looking into a lot of Black arts movement and Harlem Renaissance in the early and mid 20th century, because that's their vision, and a lot of their work done really informed the community and artists that I was looking at. This is the first, so we are exploring how artists and musicians engaged with music to build solidarity and to redefine Asian American identities in the 80s and 90s. And this is actually the first survey in this subject in Philadelphia, but also in the United States. This is the first institutional attempt to refine their work as a movement. And then there are 2 things that we are focusing on. The one is multiculturalism. Even if it's a Asian American led movement in music, there's a lot of people of color artists participated, including Max Roach, James Newton, William Parker, from all like Black and Black jazz musicians that they collaborated. So this is actually cross-cultural spirit of creative camaraderie back in the day. And the second is, this was an interdisciplinary movement combining literature, poetry, dance, theater, opera, and martial arts. It is this movement together with a very important jazz aesthetic and an enthusiasm for improvisation and a number of artists and musicians and performers during that time period. The exhibition revolves around over 400 archive materials that we gathered from different places, archives and institutions located in multiple cities across the states, including Yale University, Northeastern University, University of Connecticut, University of Minnesota, but also art museums like Guggenheim, the Kitchen, the BAM, Brooklyn Academy of Music, and Walker Art Center, East Side Freedom Library. A lot of institutions and individuals participated to make this happen, which I deeply appreciate. And actually, when I first started my research, there were hundreds of images and files that weren't even digitized or cataloged. There wasn't even a folder listing of artists' names. So this is really the first time that we list not only some of the names, but also pull together the work done during this time period. This is the University of Connecticut Library. Was literally living in Connecticut last summer to look through their 18,000 archive materials that Fred Ho donated before he passed away to this special archives collection for Asian American Studies Department at University of Connecticut. It wasn't my intention to go through all of them, but I actually submitted a very curated list of materials that I wanted to see, but then the library just put out the entire folders that if you look at the box, there were like 18 of them with all this like 40, 50 folders in each box. And I had no choice but just to look through all of them because the library itself also never didn't have a chance to list or catalog those items in their system. So I learned a lot about the work that Fred Ho did, but also the all like social movement that he engaged with in the community. Yeah, this is Walker Art Center Archives Room, and this is Guggenheim Archives. This is a VHS tape that I went through. So back in the days, a lot of were recorded in VHS tape, and then they didn't even know that they had a tape about some of the work by Fred Ho. And this is someone's basement that I was digging into. There are a lot of folders like this that's been sitting there for 30, 40 years. So what we were trying to do with this exhibition is to create more access point, more access to these archives, this embodied knowledge and collective knowledge that's marginalized, that's all lost culture and almost erased. A lot of people probably wouldn't recognize some of the names that we are highlighting in the exhibition. And there's this sense of urgency in the community because a lot of these artists are reaching the end of their natural lives. So it was really important for us to put together and gather their information before we lose the voices. If you come to Philly, you can all see these materials and photographs that I'm presenting today in person. So the exhibition is underscoring three artistic groups. One is Asian Improv Records and Arts, and second, Jason Huang's The Far East Side Band, and the third, the Fred Ho's Afro-Asian Music Ensemble. It begins with Asian Improv Arts and Records, started in San Francisco by John Zhang and Francis Huang. They wanted to start a record label that can present themselves as of their choosing and represent the values that they feel reflect their own Asian American identities. But back in the day, like most of the record labels were run by white musicians and then they were never invited. So they started their own platform and work with musicians in the Bay Area. And later they extended their office to Chicago, Asian Improv Arts and Record, Midwest. They are in North Chicago, run by Tatsu Aoki. Some of you may know Tatsu. Tatsu immigrated from Japan in the 70s, and he studied art at the Institute of Art in Chicago, and still here in Chicago running Asian Improv Arts and Records Midwest office, and it's their headquarters now. So they, in the 80s, they participated a lot of political events and a lot of campaigns, including Japanese American redress and reparation movement, Free South African movement, Free Political Prisoner movement, and a lot of civil rights movement, including gay rights movement. And if you look at this photo, you may recognize that's Jesse Jackson and Lily Chen, the mother of Vincent Chin. It's one of their rally in San Francisco, Chinatown in 1984. Jesse Jackson, presidential campaign is one of their major achievement in their political activism by Asian Improv Arts and Records. And Jesse Jackson is actually the second African-American man who ran for presidential campaign in the United States, and actually the first presidential candidate who advocated for Asian American issues. So the community really worked together to bring Black and Asian community together. If you look at this banner by the window side, is the actual campaign banner that they used back in in his presidential campaign in 1988. And the group is actually started Chicago Asian American Jazz Festival back in 1996. And this is the only Asian American Jazz Festival still active. And this year is actually their 30th anniversary. If you're around in town, they're presenting this at MCA in November, if I'm right. There are different versions of Asian American jazz festivals. The first one was in San Francisco, 1980, by Mark Izu and Francis Wang and John Jang all participated. And then the New York version was actually started by Jason Huang and Fred Ho in the 80s, and followed by LA version, and then Chicago, all started by different groups and different initiative. But then they always collaborated with musicians from different backgrounds beyond their races and ethnicities. The second group is Jason Huang's the Far East Side Band. So Jason, it was one of the active members of the Basement Workshop. Basement Workshop is one of the very first artists and activist collective in Asian American community, started in Manhattan in 1970 and active until the mid 80s. So Jason met a lot of, so Basement Workshop had jam sessions every Sunday in East Village and Lower East Side. And Jason met a lot of Black musicians and Asian musicians through Basement Workshop, and they started the band Commitment, one of the very first Black and Asian art ensemble. And after the band got dissolved, he started the Far East Side Band, combining traditional Chinese, Japanese, and Korean musical elements, and synthesizing with contemporary musical elements. And one of the maybe community activism that they did was this nationwide boycott against this music venue in East Village in the 90s, run by white musicians. They put up a lot of Japanese porn-inspired women images all over their venue, and they used these images for their album cover and CD players. So Jason worked with the community, including Godzilla and KPFA, the radio station run by API communities in the Bay Area, also Berkeley and Asian New Yorkers, all this newspaper and media channels. And one of the great achievement was the venue apologized, and they reproduced the CD with the black cover later. The third group is Fred Ho's Music Ensemble, also started in New York in 1982. They actually received a lot of mainstream recognition by the established museums and institutions in New York. They got commissioned from the BAM, Brooklyn Academy of Music, and Guggenheim, the Kitchen. You can see all their video documentation if you come to see the show. But if you look at that, the first video above the photograph, black and white photograph, that's the video collage put together by Paul Chen, who's now established Asian American artist who recently had a retrospective at the Walker Art Center. But this was 20 years ago. He collaborated with the Afro-Asian Music Ensemble for the work that they premiered at the Walker Art Center in 1998, named All Power to the People, Black Panther. So that's the video that Paul Chen was making, responding to the Afro-Asian Music Ensemble work. And then the one next to it is the video documentation of the martial arts opera called Journey Beyond the West, premiered at the Brooklyn Academy of Music in 1997. It's a really represent the kind of characteristics of the crescendo movement. And it's a great example of cross-disciplinary and cross-generational collaboration that they did together back in the 80s and 90s. And I also wanted to convey a sense of their enduring legacies of their work that extends to younger artists. So we are also featuring some of the contemporary artists. This is a video by Jen Liu, Chinese American multimedia artist based in New York. She produced this work during her residency at the Kitchen in 2020. Her mission was to pick one of the work from the Kitchen collection and make her own work, and then she picked the Fred Ho and Ephrasia Music Ensemble's work called Warrior Sisters that they premiered at the Kitchen in 1998. And Jen Liu is recontextualizing it with the women perspective and what's the new potential of Black and femme body in 2020, and with the question of collective sacrifice, because back in the day in the 90s, Fred Hook, according to Jen Liu, was kind of instrumentalizing women's body, and Jen Liu find it problematic, and they was asking, like, why do we have to make sacrifice to serve the world and goodwill? Is there an alternative way of doing it? Is kind of question that she's asking through this video. And we have one more gallery, storefront, where we are fully dedicated to Philadelphia-based artists. This is a collaboration between Theodore Harris and Amiri Baraka. Amiri Baraka is the leader of Black arts movement, and both together is depicting the Black subject and oppression and struggles through their visual collage and poems. This was also from the 90s. Amiri Baraka passed away 10 years ago, but Theodore Harris recently put together their work as a book with the preface from Fred Moten from NYU University, and now people can see it in a form of book. And next to it is we are featuring the local Asian American queer zine collective called Fortune, who's going to have a show at UC Davis next year, put together by Suzette Min and Amy Sadao. This is one of their archive-based work that they put together through Asian queer archives from 1971 to 2011, looking at a lot of different aspects of civil rights movement that happened in the community, and circulated in Philadelphia community to gather people's reflections and annotations. And this is still ongoing project. We have a check-in and check-out station in the gallery where people can borrow the books and add their notes and thoughts and return throughout the exhibition period. And the last part is this modular library we have. I also wanted to provide more historical context of the society that these artists lived in and how their aesthetic was informed and shaped by the society. So we have a lot of publications and text written by either the participating artists or the thinkers and philosophers, including Amiri Barakas and a lot of political prisoners that they work with. Is kind of work that we are representing. And yep, and in tandem with the exhibition, we did Artist Active Fellowship. We put together a lot of concerts, including the one by Salim Washington, who's the Dean of Global Jazz Studies at UCLA at the opening night, and performance by local artists by Jung and Jermaine Ingram. Jung is from Korea and Jermaine is an African-American woman from Philadelphia, and they've been working together for the past 20 years in recontextualizing the cross-cultural influences in their work. And yeah, we have upcoming screening about Yuri Kochiyama, and then we just did symposium last week. So this is the Crescendo Movement and an exhibition that's on view until June 28th. And let me know if you're ever traveling through Philadelphia. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So panelists, please come up to the stage. Thank you. And this was really a wonderful panel, and really shows like possibilities of wider interpretations about Asian and Asian American artists. So last week I went to this talk by Otombo Ekanga. She's a Nigerian artist right now having an exhibition at MoMA. And she was using all the materials like raku or Japanese lacquer, African American kilt or like embroideries, but not any sculpture or painting, no Western mode of expression. And people are very accepting. And at the end, like she called herself a shaman, not as an artist. And probably in 1990s, if you say that, people would just laugh at it. But now I think the public tolerance for non-Western artists is growing much, much greater. But and today's panel was about the materiality of modern and contemporary Asian art. But as Joyce's presentation was very clear that music is the most immaterial matter of the art, art material. And then I thought the beginning when the music and art activism became together, I thought it was very strong. Or Orianna's presentation, which was just so amazing and mind-blowing, that you introduced so many different aspects of textile, and it was very political and mobile in a way, and the spatial use was something which I never really encountered before. And I think you were talking about alternative model. And when you think about the Eastern bloc of the world, and especially like Russian constructivism and productivist models, I think like something which we consider from Western notion, craft, has a very different ideas. And then finally, Ignacio's wonderful presentation. And I was so astounded to see all the Enokuras images. Like, he's not really using the color, it's like the colors are like just the stains of oil or it's something that doesn't really enter into art making, probably in Western notion. And they are all doing all these wonderful things, but probably we as scholars or curators don't have yet words to describe it. So my question today is how can we able to write or state about what is impossible, or what is unseen, or which is going to become visible through our efforts. So that was my big question. And I thought everyone's presentation was so wonderful. Congratulations.
Thank you, Midori, for your appreciation. What is the question? I'm sorry, I'm losing my mind.
You had a very good case that you brought in archives and like videos and other things. I think when we think about Asian American art, we tend to think we are marginalized or we are not recognized enough. But in fact, I think maybe Asian Americans are doing so much more and so much more impressive work than what we see in the Western models, but maybe we don't have like a structural way to describe it or understand it. And I thought archive is one thing which you can really bring out, something that hasn't been entered into our knowledge. And then also like video work or like something immaterial like music. So I was wondering how you can describe or like bring it to more historical analysis, something which we don't have a language yet. And in that case, we don't really have to copy or use Western models. I think we can create our own model probably.
Right. When I first started my research 2 years ago, I didn't know where to start because there was nothing to look at or read because no one. This is like I was working with those artists who haven't won the game of art market or we are all working against the grain of art market because which has a very selective tendency toward white straight men artists, not as much as it used to be, but still. So a lot of artists didn't even know that they're gonna have a show with their archives, and then they were telling me, "Oh, I already threw all of them away. I don't have programs and flyers because they are also moving around, and then they don't have space to keep them." So they didn't like know how important they were, and then how much history they were making. So there was this was a very fairly fresh ground in art historical term, I guess, and there's like one thing that I was realizing during my research was how much history hasn't been recorded or captured, and also how much knowledge and expertise there was around. So I was really excited about putting this together and share it with the audiences. But with this like there was a liveliness to this art historical materials that I could engage with as opposed to isolated some kind of disciplinary approach that's already in there. So I spent a lot of time thinking about how to download this information that's already living in the community, but also make some narratives that doesn't necessarily trying to fit their work into the narrative, but more like not just like without reducing their work into some kind of symbol or representation of a universal value, but trying to make space for their stories to highlight their interiority rather than frame their work in one narrative. And that's one thing that we are still trying to do we're trying to give it a form of give it a weight in a form of a book. So the exhibition catalog is the next project that we're looking at to bring it as a primary information or source of information that research or curators in the future can look into.
I'll just sort of speak quickly to your question about the different ideas of craft. And I think for me, what becomes really interesting in the sort of post-war period, especially throughout the Eastern Bloc and then into China, is that craft is sort of happening in the space outside of the bureaucratic structures that are really controlling art production. And so it becomes a place where there's more ability to experiment. You have like more freedom. And in Eastern Europe in particular, you have really radical experiments that are happening. There are experiments that are happening in China, but they're not nearly as sort of like abstract and in space and in your face, like Magdalena Abakanowicz, for example, who I think is really one of the pioneers of this practice. But then when you shift into 1980s China, you get this moment of really radical experimentation, but it is precisely because they're working in tapestry that they're able to do these experiments, and then also in many ways probably able to share their work internationally because of export permitting and also different ways in which you could sort of structure your work. You can sort of explain your work and pigeonhole it for different bureaucratic audiences who would need to approve the permits for your work to be sent abroad and then to be sent back, which I actually think is quite interesting. And, versus the artists who are showing in Magicians de la Terre, they made all of their works in situ. And I know at least for young Jie Chung, he sent artworks to Paris that were supposed to be exhibited, and then they were lost in the mail. Like they'd never sort of found their way outside of China. And then, 5 years ago or something, they were refound, which is interesting from a market perspective in many ways. But so, right, you sort of see there, just in that very short period of time, the difficulties of sort of what could get out and what couldn't. And also, I think, too, to think about what was coming in, and, you know, reframing some of our conversations around that.
That's really fascinating stuff. I was just thinking as you were talking about the work that gets lost in the mail. I mean, it's often the case around, especially around biennials and things like that, that work gets lost, right? And where does it shows up? Like in the market, maybe like a couple of years later. Since you bring up Magicien de la Terre, I can say, I mean, one thing, I probably shouldn't be saying this. We think of Geneviève Martin, the head curator for that show. But the reality and kind of it seems like it's such an incredible conceptual move that he does when he says, no artist, everybody magicien. Everybody's a magician, right? Everybody's a shaman. We're doing away with this. And it was a hugely controversial move. So it was great that you brought up the case of the artist who kind of reclaims the notion of being a shaman or doing some sort of shamanistic practice within an institutional space. The scene is that behind these like really kind of amazing and fundamental really interventions within curatorial practice, there are situations where there's woeful lack of backup at the level of logistics and even the level of handling artists and helping them like navigate a country in a different language, right? Which is from hearsay what I hear happened at Magicien de la Terre. With regards to the question about language, I mean, how can we talk about things that we do not have that we do not have words for? That's a great question. I think partly the argument that I was presenting, it's a multi-pronged argument, and it only makes sense really within the context of the book. But part of the argument has to do precisely with the type of art critical categories and the historicization, the institutionalization of certain artistic practices, how it is that certain terminology kind of ends up trumping other divergent views. And in the case of Enokura, I mean, Enokura is within this constellation. I mean, he's a kind of interesting case because he died in 1995. During the period in which he was alive, he was incredibly visible. He was the face of contemporary art. He showed at the Venice Biennale in 1978 and in 1980, right? Showed with Kawamata Tadashi, right? Miyoshi Dai. There's a bunch of people, especially women artists. Miyajima Tatsuo. Exactly. Hende, yeah. In its sense, yeah. I mean, he killed the father. Yeah. I mean, he kills Patrick in a sense, I think. I mean, obviously he's operating still within the institutional framework of art, but there's a way in which there's a kind of rearticulation of artistic practice that is happening under the framework of contemporaneity. I would say what is so interesting to me has to do precisely with the way in which art in his practice gets rearticulated in terms of what I'm calling and what I'm ultimately arguing is art as an opening to the real. Rather than just a kind of conceptual operation where there's signifiers that are manipulated. Rather, in this case, materiality immateriality understood as a type of processual interaction of materials, which becomes the place and the grounds for the rearticulation of art outside a type of semantic, semiological kind of experimentation, like, oh, the ready-made or whatever, and really kind of generating some sort of space for an encounter with the other, and ultimately a refashioning of the self. So the project is actually about subjectivity and the reclaiming and the re-articulation of subjectivity in terms of what I call subjective destitution. So yes, he kills the father at the end. Yeah.
That's very impressive. And yeah, I mean, we have to really like bring out all this uniqueness of Asian American and the Asian artist, I think. And then I think one more thing is probably what Joyce said in her response. Interiority of the art is probably very important as well. And we tend to not to like biographies of the artists. There have been a lot of like tendencies toward detesting the biography because of the structurist-based discussions that was reigning in the, I think, 70s and 80s. But how can you bring subjective voice without becoming too, I wonder, like biased way? Maybe from Ignacio to come back to Joyce.
This is a great question. I mean, the project really is about reclaiming this unit of analysis that has been so maligned within, and it's proper to Japanese art history, which is sakkaron, right? Like the discussion of the artist and discussion of the work, the oeuvre, right? And I think it is, yeah, I mean, you have to navigate a very fine line between a consideration of the life of the artist, but from a critical perspective, taking into account the critique of the subject. And I think in a sense, I'm able to do this with this specific project because it is very much running against the grain in many ways. I don't think that this is necessarily what you would do with every single artist, right? But I think it's one particular opening, and yeah, and I can refer to the work of my former colleague, Catherine Suslov, who wrote a book called The Absolute Artist, where she addresses the question of the artist as a particular kind of problem for art history and presents a strategy, while at the same time saying, we need to bring back the body of the artist. She says, she has this beautiful passage where she says, we need to, commenting on the myth of Michelangelo, kind of Michelangelo's body not rotting after it died, right? After he died. She says, well, we need to bring back the smelling body of the artist. We need to, like in all of its rottenness, right? To really kind of consider what it means to live.
It's really true that we can interpret artists to a certain degree, but I think artists are unique because they have their own dispositions. Please, Orianna. Yeah.
Oh goodness, to talk about how to bring back the artist. I'm really struggling with this, and not necessarily with the projects that I talked about today, but other projects, particularly how the identity of the artist has sort of thoroughly overshadowed the artwork they make, and how to thoughtfully evoke the artist's background, but also not making the background first, right? The artwork should come first.
1 more minute.
Okay, I'll be quick. Okay. So what the goal of the exhibition was to reposition the whole crescendo movement as central to American arts and histories. That was our premise. So it wasn't like we were like framing each artistic group in like specific narrative or anything. We were like trying to show how they are trying to make an intervention and then disrupt the already pre-existing narratives. And then we wanted to look into each group's strategy and approach to their own work, because they didn't have the platform, they didn't have the stage to present their work and to begin with, and during the 80s and 90s. So that was our approach to it. So hopefully we did what they wanted to present. But yeah, it's a hard question.
I hope the exhibition will travel to New York. So thank you, everyone. And are we on time? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Midori, and to all of our presenters, Joyce, Orianna, and Ignacio.